Hello everybody, Miss Susie here. I walked down the farm lane behind my house because I am in search of that tree right there. That is a black walnut tree. I'm going to be picking some black walnuts. I've got a special tool because those walnuts are up there pretty good. And we're going to be taking those black walnuts back to my kitchen and we're going to be making a 19th century recipe of walnut ketchup. Today on Hands into History. I'm back in my kitchen. I've got my walnut. We're ready to make some walnut ketchup. Now, I'm sure when most of you hear the word ketchup, you're thinking of this stuff right here, tomato ketchup. But originally, ketchup was made from fermented fish guts. Yum! Eventually, in the 18th and 19th centuries, ketchup was made with mostly walnuts, mushrooms, anchovies, and some recipes even called for cucumbers and oysters. The first known recipe for tomato ketchup was published in an American cookbook called the Sugar House Book, and it was created by Sandy Addison in 1801. But even then, tomato ketchup didn't catch on right away. You see what I did there? In fact, despite the Heinz Company launching their ketchup in 1876, the Webster Dictionary of 1913 defines ketchup as a table sauce made from mushrooms, tomatoes, walnuts, etc. But today, if you ask Google for the definition of ketchup, it will tell you that it's a smooth sauce made chiefly from tomatoes and vinegar, used as a condiment. No mention of walnuts, mushrooms, or fish of any kind, or their guts. Over on the Townsend's channel, they are famous for making their mushroom ketchup. But because I grew up with a black walnut tree in our backyard, and because I love black walnuts, I knew that I had to try this 19th century recipe for black walnut ketchup. I live in Western New York, and black walnut trees grow wild here. And I'm sure that they were growing well back in the 19th century in this area, and that many of the settlers took advantage of those black walnut trees. Now, my recipe comes from Mrs. Beaton's Household Management, a guide to cookery in all branches, daily duties, menu making, mistress and servant, home doctor, hostess and guest, sick nursing, marketing, the nursery, trussing and carving, home lawyer. Oh, that's quite a title for a book. Mrs. Beaton's book was first published in 1861, and actually you can still find it in print. And every time the book was reprinted, it was updated ever so slightly. But the original walnut ketchup recipe from the 1861 version of Mrs. Beaton's reads thusly. Ingredients: 100 walnuts, 1 handful of salt, 1 quart of vinegar, 1/4 ounce of mace, 1/4 ounce of nutmeg, 1/4 ounce of cloves, 1/4 ounce of ginger, 1/4 ounce of whole black pepper, a small piece of horseradish, 20 shallots, 1/4 pound of anchovies, 1 pint of port wine. Mode: procure the walnuts at the time you can run a pin through them. Slightly bruise and put them in a jar with the salt and vinegar. Let them stand 8 days, stirring every day. Then drain the liquor from them and boil it with the above ingredients for about half an hour. It may be strained or not, as preferred, and if required, a little more vinegar or wine can be added according to taste. When bottled well, seal the corks. Time, half an hour. All of the recipes that I found, ranging from the 18th century up until the early 20th century on walnut ketchup, suggested picking your walnuts anytime from June until even as late as August. But they all agreed on the same thing. You need to have a pin that can easily pierce into the walnut. And of course, you can see that I can put a pin easily through the walnuts that I picked. When that shell forms inside that walnut, you do not want to be eating something made from it. Most of the recipes I found said to use a marble mortar to pound the walnuts in. And the marble mortar is the container that goes to a mortar and pestle. And the pestle is the club portion or the stick portion that you would use to pound into the mortar. Now, I have a theory about this. I believe that they suggested using a marble mortar because when you cut open a black walnut, that juice gets all over everything and it will turn anything it touches either light brown to a very, very dark brown. It will stain so easily. So I'm sure that they wanted to use something that would not stain and also so that they wouldn't have to get their hands messy. Now today I am going to be using a nice heavy duty plate because one thing we want is that juice that collects, that comes out of the walnuts. And if I can collect that in this plate and put it into my container, then we're going to have a really nice walnut ketchup. And I'm also going to be chopping my walnuts up, and many of the recipes said to pound the walnuts and crush them. But since I don't have a mortar and pestle, I can't do that. So I figured chopping is going to be just as good. And for protection, rubber gloves, because I do not want my hands to get all black. I'm going to try and have the recipe because my recipe says to use 100 walnuts, and I don't think I'm going to fit 100 walnuts into this glass jar. So I'm going to try for 50. We'll see how many I can do. All right, that's 10. All right, I've got all of them chopped, and you can see all of that juice that came out of these walnuts. You see that, how dark it is? That would stain anything, and you can see that my gloves are stained. You can also see how those walnuts really change color and they start oxidizing after they've been cut, especially that rind. This light portion is actually what will be the walnut, and the outer portion is what will fall away and get really brown in the fall time when they come off the tree. That needs to come off, and then you can actually crack the walnut and eat it. The 1861 original version of the recipe says to use a handful of salt for every 100 walnuts. Since I have 50, I have to divide a handful of salt in half. But thank goodness I found a 1907 updated version of Mrs. Beeton's. That says to use 100 green walnuts, 1 quart of good vinegar, and 3 ounces of salt. I need 1.5 ounces of salt for all of these walnuts that I have. I'm going to be using canning and pickling salt. You don't want to use iodized salt. They did not have iodized salt back then. Iodized salt wasn't created until the 1920s. We want to use something that is close to the original. I'm using Morton's All Natural Canning and Pickling Salt. I need to measure out 1.5 ounces. That looks good. So we'll put that in there. And I am going to be using raw apple cider vinegar because being here in Western New York State, we had a lot of apple trees, we still do. So I think that would be most authentic to this area. It says it has the mother, which is some of that sediment that you see on the bottom. And that means it hasn't been pasteurized or filtered or anything. And this is about a quart. I just need to put in half of this. I'm not sure if it's going to fill all the way up, but we'll see. I've used more than half a quart for these, and I'm not sure about this because they're not all covered. I'm just going to add the whole quart. I think I might add a little bit more salt too. It could be because my walnuts are bigger than perhaps theirs were. That's why I'm adding twice as much. I'm actually going to add a little bit more vinegar to this. I'm going to add enough just to make sure that these are covered. And I think I'll put in just a little bit more salt too. You know, this is how they used to make their recipes. Sometimes it wasn't about exact measurements, especially with things like this. And I think having put that extra vinegar in is going to cover these nicely because we don't want them to go bad. And vinegar being a preservative will help these to not get moldy. I'm going to put the cover on. I'm going to let these set on the counter, and then I'm going to stir it every day for 8 days, like the recipe said, and then I'll be back and we'll finish this recipe. Yes, it has been 1 year and 20 days since I shot that video, which means I should have done the video 1 year and 12 days ago. But here I am. I've got the walnuts still. I have been stirring them almost every day since I made that video, believe it or not. But to be fair, for this recipe, I decided to make another batch of walnuts from this year. So this batch has been going longer than 8 days. It has been going for, I actually can't remember when I did these, but it was in July. So I'll put the date, I'll put when I actually did this somewhere here. So things have changed a little bit since we've last been in my kitchen. I have a new pot rack. I will take some lovely B-roll to show you my new pot rack. I love my new pot rack. So that's what's changed. And so today we're gonna get this recipe started. We're gonna get it cooked, and then we'll have a taste testing. What I've got is my year-old and 20-day-old walnuts. And I've got my walnuts that are however many days old. They have been soaking here. So here's the difference. So we've got these walnuts, which you can see, they're very, very black. And then these, which I did a little different. I actually crushed these. You can see these are more crushed. And these are not as black yet. And what I did with this batch is I actually did crush them. I used the same amount of walnuts. I used 50 walnuts. There were 50 in here. I actually crushed them with my cast iron skillet on the cutting board, and I was really surprised because not very much juice came out onto the cutting board. So I was able to crush them and get them to fit in this jar with a quart of vinegar, like I was supposed to, and I believe a half a quart, and then the appropriate amount of salt. Now, the only difference I did here is I totally forgot to use apple cider vinegar. So this one has white vinegar and this one has apple cider vinegar. But because I know this is the correct amount of liquid for the recipe, I'm going to drain this one first and see how much liquor I have left according to my recipe. And then I'll drain this one and use the same amount so that I can put in all of my spices and all of the other ingredients, and we'll cook it on the stovetop. Okay, that's about 3 cups. So I only need 3 cups out of this one. I might do a double batch of this though, because I have so much of the liquid. We'll see how much I get out of here. Okay, so in goes my 3 cups of liquor from the walnuts. Then I have all of my spices. Now the recipe says with 100 walnuts, you need 1/4 ounce of each of these spices, but I had to divide that in half. So I was able to measure out 1/8 of an ounce, and I actually converted these to grams, ounces to grams, so I could get an accurate amount. But this is all of my spices. So in those go. And then I have my shallots, which I actually grow shallots in my garden. And so I'm putting in the shallots. And then I have my horseradish, which I also grow. And what is a small piece of horseradish? I don't know. So what would it be, 1/2 of a small piece of horseradish? I don't know. So I'm just guessing. So this is what the horseradish looks like when it comes out of the ground. And then this is what it looks like after I have peeled it. And then I have just chopped up enough for each of my recipes into a fine chop. And so I picked a piece about this big to kind of guesstimate as what a small piece of horseradish is. So in goes my horseradish. Then it asks for 1/4 pound of anchovies. Now, 1/4 pound is 4 ounces, so I need 2 ounces, and it just so happens that these little containers that I got in the store are 2 ounces of anchovies. And I was researching anchovies because I didn't know if I would need dried anchovies, but a lot of recipes I found in the 19th century used either imported dried anchovies, and then people would reconstitute them or soak them in an oil, and then they would use that all that liquor, the liquid that they were soaked in, and let them keep going, and so that they would have them fresh to use in recipes. So I'm just going to, and these are in oil, so I'm just going to put the anchovies right in like that. I'm not even going to chop them up. And then we're supposed to put in some port wine. And it says a pint of port wine, but that is, of course, for 100 walnuts. So a pint is 2 cups. So I have 1 cup of pint. I have 1 cup of port wine here. It tastes just like the wine my father used to make when I was a little kid. It tastes really good. Although I'm not an alcohol person. But in goes the port wine. And now we'll put this one on the stove. We'll boil it for ½ an hour. That's what the recipe says. And then we'll come back when it's done. But next I'm going to strain this one and get it going just like this one. You can see this has a lot of sludge in the bottom. Of course, it's been sitting for a year, so I'm going to see if I can get that out of there. These are really, really black. You can see how black they are. Wow, look at that. Those are just black, not even brown anymore. I was considering keeping these walnuts because you can make pickled walnuts with the same method, but they were a little too big. With pickled walnuts, you usually keep them whole. So I think that I'm gonna try maybe pickled walnuts next year when the trees are much more abundant, because I have noticed that our walnut trees, black walnut trees, tend to have a really bumper crop year and then a very lean year. Last year was a bumper crop. There were tons of walnuts on the trees, but this year there were hardly any. So it was really difficult finding enough to make that batch that I just made this year. So let's see how much liquor we have from this left over. I have 5 cups of the liquid, so I think I'm going to just use the same amount of spices and horseradish and everything else, because I think recipes were so flexible back then. I don't think it's going to matter too much. I've got my other batch boiling here. I've actually turned it down to a simmer because I really don't want it to get crazy. We'll start this one. Whoops, there's some sludge in there. I don't think I'll put the sludge in. I'm using a non-metal pan because I don't want the acid to interact with the metal. So that's why I'm using these porcelain pans and the coated cast iron. So we'll get in our spices, our horseradish root, our shallots, our anchovies, and our 1 cup of port wine. And now this is going to go on the stove to boil for half an hour as well.
I cooked my walnut ketchup down, and check this out. After I got done, look at how thick and rich that looks. Wow. That's just amazing. And I decided to strain mine. I wanted a nice sauce with no chunks in it. So I strained each batch, and I had these adorable shrub bottles that I had left over. They have cork tops. I thought it would be perfect for this. So I put the walnut ketchup into these bottles, and it fit perfectly. And I just think it looks adorable. Turned out great. I think it's going to taste great. And let's see if it does taste good.
My walnut ketchup is done. I cooked each batch the same amount of time, and the recipe said I could either strain it or leave the solids in. I chose to strain it. I used these bottles that I had left over from some shrub drink that I bought locally, and the last year's batch fit perfectly into 2 of the bottles, and this year's batch fit perfectly into 1 bottle. They also have different coloring. This year's batch is lighter in color, and I think it's because it didn't sit in the brine as long, obviously, not for a year like the others did, and also due to possibly the fact that I used white vinegar instead of apple cider vinegar. This year's batch also turned out a little bit thicker than last year's, and I think that's probably due to the ratio of ingredients. And that leads me to believe that this year's batch may possibly be a little bit more salty because the anchovies bring in a saltiness to the recipe, and because that's more concentrated, there was less liquid to begin with, it may possibly be a little more salty. So I'm going to taste test last year's batch first. We'll see what it tastes like. So I had to mix these up a little bit because it did seem like it was settling. So let's see what it tastes like. Oh, that definitely tastes like, my first thought is that it tastes just like Worcestershire sauce. It's vinegary. I can taste the spices, a hint of all the spices, the cloves, the nutmeg, the ginger. I taste almost a faintness. There's a smoothness about it. I really don't taste the walnuts like I would have thought I would. But it's a very nice taste. It's very good. It is salty. It is salty, but not so salty that you can't taste it. And so now I'll taste this year's. We'll see what that tastes like. Oh, that definitely tastes different. Oh, definite difference between this year's and last year's. I definitely taste more of the walnut taste. I can taste the spices again. It is a little bit saltier, which I expected that. Very, very interesting, the taste difference between the two. The recipe did say that I could add more wine or vinegar to them to taste, but I would say that they're fine just the way they are. So I'm going to leave them this way. Many of the recipes that I found when I was researching this receipt use this walnut ketchup in sauces and gravies, mostly to be used with meats. And I could see how this could be mixed with some tomato ketchup and used just like an A1 steak sauce. This would be very good that way. I'm going to have to try that. And I'm going to have to find some recipes that use walnut ketchup, and we'll see what it tastes like. There's a wide variety of walnut ketchup recipes when you are looking through all of the 19th century cookbooks. Some used only a few spices like mace and cloves, and just garlic added, and no shallots, no onions, or some used onions instead of shallots. And many of them eliminated the anchovies and the wine and just used the spices. And some recipes put the walnuts in more of a pickle with water and salt, like a brine, and let them sit in the water and salt for a length of time. And then that was drained off, and then it was cooked in vinegar and spices to create the ketchup. So there's a wide variety of receipts or recipes for this condiment or this seasoning. It's also mentioned in several recipes that this is good as a medicine for a cough and to take 3 times a day, and also that it keeps for a very long time, with one receipt saying that it will keep 20 years in the greatest perfection, but is not fit for use the first year. Now, it would be interesting to taste this after a year, because let me show you the walnuts from each batch. These are the walnuts from the year-old batch. And you can see that they are very, very, how do I want to say it? And that they're very mushy. They got a lot more mushy, and I can just crumble them apart. And this is one from this year's batch, and you can see it's a lot more green. And if I pull it apart, it's still soft, but that's what the inside looks like. And I thought that I would taste just the walnuts to see if that is why these taste a little bit different. So this is last year's walnut. So we'll take a little taste of that. It does have a vinegary taste, but it's very subtle taste. Now I'll taste the walnut from this year's batch. Oh, I can definitely taste the black walnut taste that's so prevalent in these nuts. I'm getting that essence strongly from this one compared to last year's. So sitting in the brine, just like the recipe says that it's not fit for use for 1 year, obviously makes sense that after time, it will change its flavor and become less strong, more of a subtle taste. And they also smell different. Very different in taste and smell. So it would be interesting to taste this after 1 year. See what happens. If it lasts that long. I may be using these up in recipes, but hopefully I can save some and maybe we can do a taste test next year. It would also be interesting to use a recipe next year that doesn't include anchovies and wine, and it only includes the spices and maybe some garlic, and see what that tastes like and compare it to these. You know, making a recipe like this, something like my ancestors would have made, is kind of like a pirate discovering some treasure. But let me remind you that the best treasure is in your family tree, and that's you. I'll see you soon.